But let me start by explaining two words in my title. First of all, the word scientific. And here we have a picture of a man who was not a scientist, but he was the first person to develop a concept of what the sciences could become, contemporary of Shakespeare, Francis Bacon. And the natural science tradition emerged in the 17th century, first formulated by him in a major work called Novum Organum, from 1620, Novum Organum, the new instrument. Now here is a critical and really beautiful quotation. Those who have handled sciences have been either men of experiment or men of dogmas. The men of experiment are like the ant. They only collect and use. The reasoners resemble spiders who make cobwebs out of their own substance. But the bee takes a middle course. It gathers material from the flowers of the garden or the field, but transforms and digests it by a power of its own. Not unlike this is the true business of philosophy, for it neither relies solely or chiefly on the powers of the mind, nor does it take the matter which it gathers from natural history and mechanical experiments and lay it up in the memory whole just as it finds it, but lays it up in the understanding, altered and digested. Therefore, from a closer and purer league between these two faculties, the experimental and the rational, such has never been made, much may be hoped. Wow, 400 years ago. But briefly then, we could define, just a moment, where have we got to? That tradition as a method of combining reasoning and empirical evidence as a way to approach truth about the natural world. And Bacon was really resolving a debate which had been fought over for the previous 2,000 years between empiricism and rationalism as the way to truth. Modern insistence on evidence-based medicine or evidence-based policy has thus missed one half of the tradition, although it thinks of itself as being scientific. In any case, in study of mental disorders, a serious question is begged: is the human mind part of the natural world? Or is it better dealt with by theologians, philosophers, or legal minds? Now, the other word I want to clarify, the term classification. Of course, this is a sort of formalized type of a description. I ask, can description ever be neutral with respect to theory? I don't believe it can. Carl Linnaeus was the 17th century Swedish scholar who classified plants. He also classified diseases, by the way. He held that classification of plants should be based on the reproductive organs of the plants. It was a shrewd hunch, which you might say got some sort of rationality after the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. But for Linnaeus himself, as far as I know, it lacked any real rational basis. But it was not neutral with regards to theory. Now, I think you will know what the words DSM stand for, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. In the introduction to that, it claims to be theory neutral, but implicitly it assumes theoretical assumptions. For instance, that mental disorders are imposed on normal mental function rather than being an imbalance of factors that are normally present within the human brain or mind. That's a debate between two models of disease, which again goes back to antiquity, but DSM itself does not address. Those theoretical assumptions in classification systems often are not explicit. They may be unknown even to the persons that are proposing a scheme of classification. So overtly or covertly, classification is often based on authority of a person or of an organization, to put it crudely, those with the biggest boots. However, in the true science tradition, there's no room for that sort of authority, only the authority of reason and evidence carefully combined. So, in that sense, many systems of classification lack scientific rationality. Now, Linnaeus appears to have been quite a bombastic individual. He had the temerity to name the species of which he's a member Homo sapiens, as though wisdom was a defining characteristic of our species. In classifying plants, he thought he was defining a natural order, a set of natural types. That style of classification was transferred in the 19th century to classification of diseases using the same sort of Latin binomial terminology. In his own day, for plants with insight, you could say Linnaeus was mainly correct, but in his own day, it was not obvious. Anyway, Linnaeus had a contemporary, a Frenchman by the name of Georges Buffon, who had an aphorism, nature knows only the individual. Now, in botanical classification, I think it's clear that Linnaeus was right and Buffon was wrong. In psychiatry, I suggest the issue is not resolved. It's not yet clear whether psychiatry should be dealing with each person as an individual or whether classification has some merits, classifications to groups. So let's go on from there to a brief history of some of the classification in psychiatry, especially in the German-speaking world. So the first figure I want to talk about, this man, Wilhelm Greisinger, he had the concept of Einheitspsychose, unitary psychosis, and the idea probably grew from debate in the Germanic world amongst, I think, what you'd call romantic philosophers who were rejecting the endless tendency towards conceptual splitting of earlier philosophers from the Age of Reason, as it's called. So somehow, Greisinger thought that the mind, whether in health or sickness, had to be some sort of unity. Now, the next person I want to mention, Carl Ludwig Karlbaum. A fine clinician, I understand. He never held an academic position and his significance was grasped only after his death. He stressed careful clinical interviewing and documenting the longitudinal trajectory of each patient's disorder. He rejected the unitary psychosis concept, and so he constructed what was probably the first system of classification in the Germanic world. Now, at the time, his system was held to be too complicated to be useful in practice, but some of his concepts have still survived. The concept I want to draw on, which I think is only a small part of his system, is that there are transitional periods in life when people become especially vulnerable to particular forms of mental disorder. The two particular transitional stages in life that he mentioned, adolescence, from which the concept of hebephrenia was derived, and later with Kraepelin, dementia praecox, and then later schizophrenia. And also the transition that occurs in the later years of life when dementia of the elderly becomes more likely. Now, from there, we go on to someone who is very important, Emil Kraepelin, still a dominating influence in psychiatric classification. I could go into quite a lot of detail, but I'm trying to move fairly fast so that I can finish in time and perhaps time for a few questions. He claimed to base his work on Karlbaum's, but I think he was far less of a true clinician than Karlbaum, let alone a clinical scientist. Now, his term dementia praecox, early dementia, was a Latin version of the French term démence précoce from Benedict Morel. I think today, most people would think that the term schizophrenia, which is what came from dementia praecox, to call it dementia is completely wrong. Now, I just want to make 3 points briefly about Kraepelin. It is claimed that his classification was based on evidence about many patients compiled in a complex diagnostic card system. I think the German word is Zählkarten. And the most important distinction we now have is between bipolar disorder and dementia praecox, which became schizophrenia. And that was first made public in 1898. Now, there are some of Kraepelin's cards still in existence from that period, and frankly, the study that's been made of those existing cards shows that they just don't contain enough evidence to make the classification that Kraepelin based on them. And Hermann Berrios, the editor of the journal History of Psychiatry, in which this paper appeared, comments that these cards cannot be seen as the sole evidential basis for the classification system without analysis being guided, and I quote, by deep a priori views as to how the objects in this field should be defined, explained and classified. The second point I want to make is that it's worth looking at Kraepelin's credentials. Now, I could go into the details of this after the talk is over, but basically, I think there's enough detail about Kraepelin's life to say that when eventually he was appointed to this prestigious chair in Heidelberg, he had never had any proper training in detailed clinical interviewing and not much opportunity to do it. He had, for instance, just come from Dorpat, present-day Tartu in Estonia, where the languages are very different, and he couldn't converse with his patients, that sort of thing. But I could go into more detail about that. The third point is that actually, when Kraepelin was separating dementia praecox from manic depressive illness in the late 1890s, he appears to have depended more on what he thought the end state would be, rather than full information on the total trajectory or course of a disorder, as Karlbaum might have advised. So, thus, it is really an administrator's classification to separate those who would get better from those who could never leave the asylum, not that of a clinician scientist whose mission was to help personal health of his patients. And so, since then, systems for diagnosis have never really been based on scientific reasoning. Psychiatric diagnosis, as it evolved over the last century, I mean, there have been many good clinicians, of course, but the actual diagnostic systems were not designed to help conscientious professionals concerned about personal health care, but rather the interests of administrators. In Kraepelin's day, that was the administration of asylums. Today, with DSM and ICD and so on, it is largely the administration of health finances, especially in the USA. Let me go on now to the real pioneer. Karl Wernicke is his portrait. He's known in the English-speaking world as a pioneer of neurology. In fact, for the last 20 years of his life, he worked in a psychiatric institution in Breslau, present-day Wrocław, in Western Poland. And so, working with John Dennison, we managed to produce this, have the great privilege of translating this amazing work of Karl Wernicke, Grundriss der Psychiatrie. Now, Wernicke was working on another edition of this in 1905 when he died prematurely in a bicycling accident. His life's work then incomplete, and his work was soon eclipsed by other prominent figures at the time, especially Kraepelin. Wernicke was usually very generous to his professional rivals, but for Kraepelin he had nothing but withering scorn. Without any hesitation, I regard the work we translated and edited, this is 41 lectures given to a class of very advanced students, I regard it as the best scientific writing on psychiatry I've ever read. And he's the only person I have read who really tried to develop a system of classification based on scientific reasoning. He also appears to be a very skilled and compassionate clinician. So let's look at what Wernicke was as a neuroscientist. And here we're talking about the first 8 of those lectures. In his day, the neuron theory, the idea that the brain was composed of cells like the rest of the body, very unusual sort of cells, that theory developed by Camille Golgi and Cajal That was hot news at the time. Those two got one of the very first Nobel Prizes. In the 1890s, the knowledge of the neuron theory must have been widespread already. At that time, no one had a clue about the nature of the signals carried by nerve cells. Nonetheless, in the 1890s, Wernicke had worked out the following. First of all, the fundamental basis for learning was modification of selected synapses impinging on cortical nerve cells. So the cerebral cortex, he called it the organ of association. In 3 words, you couldn't do better. That any percept or concept which arouses subjective awareness was represented not by single nerve cells, but by collections of nerve cells scattered widely over the cortex. Here, he was 50 years ahead of Donald Hebb, to whom we usually attribute that insight. Now, so we've got the method of acquiring memories. What about the memories themselves? The trove of memories so acquired, what Wernicke called the contents of consciousness, fell into 3 parts. First, our awareness of the continuity of over time of our body from proprioceptors and interoceptors, the awareness from which we first gain a notion of ourselves as enduring entities. The phrase was the primary ego. Second, the second of these 3 components, the continuities we learned from the external environment, via the distance sensors, eyes and ears. This, of course, also includes the social environment. And third, the unique set of memories we accumulate about our own life story. And I think there, modern terminology would be to call them episodic memories, memories of events that occurred only once. But most impressive is what I call his theory of personhood, his theory of what it is to be a person. Here we see Wernicke at his very best. This comes in his seventh lecture after having built up to it in the first 6 lectures. I think here he is ahead of most of today's practitioners. With the cerebral cortex as the organ of association, we strive throughout our lives to assimilate those 3 components of memory, integrating them to create for each of us a sense of self. That's a modern term. That is, throughout our lives, we are constructing and continually reconstructing our sense of being a person, to be as fully integrated as possible. Now, it's Wernicke's inspiration which emboldens me to think I can produce a system for describing and classifying mental disorders which really is suitable for today's clinical scientists working in mental health, a system based on solid scientific reasoning, one which does aid clinical practice of physicians dedicated to personal health care in a way which DSM or ICD in their various versions never did. Now let's go on. That's right. Now, in moving towards a proper scientific classification, I've been influenced by a number of factors. First of all, Matthias described me as a freelance researcher, which is a rather odd title, but I wear it proudly, shall we say. Getting away from academia 16 years ago and knocking around with various community groups has exposed me to a wide variety of conceptual languages to describe mental disorders. Sometimes these have been carefully thought out, coherent ways of thinking, albeit a challenge to orthodoxy. And I have much sympathy with many of those views. Sometimes they're less coherent, sometimes they're just emotional polemics, which I just shrug my shoulders. Secondly, in May 2013, there was a sort of dispute broke out between the American Psychiatric Association and National Institutes of Mental Health in the USA, largest funder of mental health research worldwide. DSM-5, the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, was released in May that year, and a fortnight before that, NIMH let it be known that it is moving away from DSM categories in the research it sponsors. In New Zealand, 3 years later, I can just comment, DSM-5 is hardly used at all. Now, the third thing is my big book on schizophrenia, which was published in 2008. The debate about diagnostic criteria is especially sharp about schizophrenia. And with this big book that I published, you might expect me to be a staunch supporter of the S word and the concept underlying it. That's not so, actually. That book never made use of official definitions. It started from three rather preliminary criteria to define the area that I was interested in. First of all, the occurrence of episodes of active psychosis, that's my phrase, dominated by delusions, hallucinations mainly. Secondly, a constellation of non-psychotic traits that involve most areas of psychological function. And thirdly, peak age of onset in late adolescence or early adulthood. Now, my intention was to refine these three criteria as I developed the theory. And I did that with regard to the first two. But the third one, the age of onset criteria, I seldom referred to it and never in a crucial way. In addition, the largest part of that book attempted to explain, on the basis of assumptions about the brain, all those non-psychotic traits associated with schizophrenia as it is diagnosed. 8 years later, I see no reason to reject that reasoning to explain those traits, but I realise they're not at all specific to schizophrenia. They sometimes occur in the general population, and I suspect they're present at elevated rates in persons given a variety of other diagnoses, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, so on. So now I've stopped using the S word as though it has a proper scientific meaning, though I might use it in other contexts. Anyway, let's go on to the basic principles that might underlie a system of classification. At the heart of a scientific classification, there should be conceptual clarity. And again, I want to quote Francis Bacon. This is Francis Bacon in that same work, 1620. If the notions themselves, which is the root of the matter, are confused and over-hastily abstracted from the facts, there can be no firmness in the superstructure. So, I ask, how can we move from the present state of basic concepts, which, at least in my view, are confused and over-hastily abstracted from the facts, to a situation where concepts are robust and therefore of greater practical use? Now, the second principle I want to talk about is what I call cross-level explanation. There is a maxim which has been guiding me for many years, which I recently included in a review paper on the subject of validating concepts in mental disorder. And this is how it could be expressed. The only way in which a scientific concept can be validated in a way which will stand the test of time is to find a way of defining it which supports and is supported by strong explanatory arguments. That's a pretty tough discipline, which is why real progress in science is so slow. By explanatory arguments, I refer especially to what I call cross-level explanations. A sound explanation should be based on assumptions that are external to what it is intended to explain. Otherwise, there is a danger of explanation becoming circular. And in psychiatry, that means that explaining psychological findings in terms of psychological concepts or assumptions runs this risk. Now, in other areas of the natural sciences, explanations which really made history explained a range of findings at one level in terms of assumptions at a lower level, themselves grounded in the already existing common language of the natural sciences. Now, in psychiatry, that would mean explaining psychological findings in terms of assumptions at the level of nerve cells, their morphology, their biophysics, perhaps their transmitter, pharmacology, and neurochemistry. Although I think that third one has perhaps been overemphasized because of the power of the drugs industry. And that remark is not meant to decry the use of pharmaceuticals in psychiatry, but for explanations, we don't need to think in those terms. Now, the next point I want to make is about the normal in relation to the abnormal. In general medicine, understanding an abnormal situation has usually arisen in closer relation to understanding the normal one. Sometimes it's one that takes the lead, sometimes it's the other, but usually the two advance in knowledge roughly in parallel. So we came to understand diabetes mellitus in parallel with our understanding of the endocrine role of the pancreas, or we understand heart disease in relation to the normal function of the heart. Now, what does that mean in psychiatry? It means we need to have a scientific theory of human nature in order to understand mental disorders. Now, hitherto, and we go back more than 2,000 years to Plato, even as far back as Pythagoras, human nature has been defined by philosophers or theologians along the lines that we are fundamentally rational beings. Well, for me, that is hardly credible. Some of us are slightly rational some of the time, shall we say. With regard to human nature, the scientific revolution of the 17th century seems to have overlooked this question, and supposedly scientific psychiatry grew by grafting its specialist professional knowledge onto a model of human nature which was not itself grounded in the common language of the natural sciences. As a result, in my view, there has been something of a disjunction between the claims about the scientific status of the profession and the reality. Now we come to Wernicke. Wernicke's model of human personhood, which I outlined just now, is a magnificent start to getting beyond this. But today we have much better knowledge about the brain itself. I think we can do much better based on modern understanding of the brain. Now the next point I want to make is about representation of context, and this is referring to some of my own theoretical work, which was actually very much helped by the late Valentino Breitenberg, and this book, Cortico-Hippocampal Interplay and the Representation of Context in the Brain, was one in the series that Valentino edited. Wernicke's designation of the cerebral cortex as the organ of association is essentially correct, but it's not the whole story. As an organ of association, the cortex cannot represent percepts or concepts without ambiguity. To resolve that ambiguity, representation of percepts or concepts has to locate them in their appropriate context. Now, thinking of mammals generally, especially territorial mammals like a rat, as they navigate through their environment, the most important such context is a spatial one, a sort of spatial mapping, a function for which the brain structure called the hippocampus plays a crucial role. Now, this insight was first formulated in the book 1978, The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map by O'Keefe and Nardole, and 18 months ago, John O'Keefe was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine for what came out of subsequently. However, it has always struck me that for humans, we should view the term context in a more abstract and general way. There are very many varieties of information processing, all needing different contexts, different professionals, different roles each of us play. But the basic principle is the same. To have the right context active in the brain permits us to do things that are way beyond the capacity of the cerebral cortex, just as an organ of association. Now, one faculty which is so enabled is to retrieve episodic memories, memories of incidents in our lives which happened only once, provided we can also reinstate the context of neural activity in which those memories were initially acquired. So in 1991, this book contains a theory of how the cerebral cortex and the hippocampus interact so as to discover the context which best serves particular sorts of information processing. Now, the acquisition of those contexts is a difficult and lengthy process. When they're acquired, those contexts can be used for a variety of functions, of which retrieval of episodic memory is one. That theory came almost entirely from research in animals. But recently, I've come to see how it can apply to human psychology, to the notion of human personhood, and to defining many forms of mental disorder. So we go on to the next stage of the argument, what I call contexts for living in humans. Infants start to become aware of themselves as an enduring entity at about the same age as they acquire both continuity of memory, usually at the age of 2 or 3, and the beginnings of language. Now, by then, they have discovered what we could call their primary ego from awareness of the continuity of their own body over time. From another point of view, on the same basis, you could say they have discovered the context which enables them to retrieve episodic memories. And that ability then is more or less the defining feature, more or less synonymous with being a person. You can't be a person without continuity of memory. And from such reasoning, I'm developing a concept which may be important in psychiatry, what I call the notion of a context for living, very closely related to the phrase sense of self. This, then, is the modern version of Wernicke's idea that each of us is engaged until the day we die in constructing and forever reconstructing our sense of being a person. It's also very similar to a concept of the person Viktor Frankl, someone you might know of, explained in his work called Man's Search for Meaning. That was actually based on a very terrible experience in concentration camps. And in that terrible situation, for a person to have a context in which his or her life still held a meaning, quite literally, it could be a lifesaver. Now, my concept of context for living is very much the same, although it's developed initially from brain theory, from experience of the savagery of the concentration camps. But it's basically the same, since meaning, quite generally, depends on locating information in an appropriate context. Contexts for living, or sense of meaning to one's life, are formulated best, if at all, by putting them into words, which is perhaps why Viktor Frankl named his variety of psychotherapy logotherapy, logo meaning words. Now, let me move on a little way. Right, continue a few more principles for scientific classification. There's another facet, the neuroscientific basis of personhood. Wise people from time immemorial have written in praise of self-knowledge, and it's a concept which is important in most forms of psychotherapy. But logically, just from a logical point of view, if we assume the self to be a unitary entity, self-knowledge just can't be possible. Now, in resolving this, I'm indebted to my former PhD student, Kate Ball. Here she is with her husband, Phil. Phil is a Maori in New Zealand, and I could tell you about his tribal affiliation, if you like. He's a very, very gifted man, both of them are. But in her doctoral thesis, Kate analyzes the self as having two parts continually interacting with one another, corresponding to the psychic functions of the left and the right hemispheres. The right hemisphere is adept at responding moment by moment to events of daily living as they occur. She calls this the self-experiencing now, while the left hemisphere continually conceptualizes these experiences and the growing notion of the self. And the continual interplay between these two create a subjective sense of a unified self, and it occurs, of course, via the corpus callosum. And this makes what we call self-knowledge possible, but actually it is the conceptualizing self continually updating its perspective on the self-experiencing now. Now, this gives a convincing account of the otherwise strange anomaly of selfhood, which you sometimes see in severe cases of schizophrenia and in some other disorders. A person prefers to refer to themselves objectively, for instance, in the third person, rather than subjectively as the ego or the I of everyday speech. That strange anomaly arises by predominance of the left hemisphere conceptualizing self with some sort of atrophy of what Kate calls the self-experiencing now. Now we're getting to the end of this list of principles, but the next one is about personality theory. The word personality draws attention to the individual differences between people. Personhood refers to a more generic thing. Personality. Ways to describe personality go back to antiquity. In the modern era, there are two pioneers who have defined enduring personality traits, Ivan Petrovich Pavlov in Russia and Carl Gustav Jung. Now, to designate a personality trait as permanent relies first on evidence of lifelong continuity of a trait, and also of its being determined at least in part by genetic factors. Now, there's a large body of research on this. Some traits that are called personality traits are determined mainly by environmental factors, but others substantially by genetic ones. Insofar as personality traits are determined partly by genetic factors, one can conclude that they arise from aspects of each individual's brain, and since they are enduring, those determinants are likely to be aspects of the brain which are relatively permanent, that is, aspects of brain morphology. And here I'm thinking mainly of cellular morphology, not gross morphology, but not so much the ever-changing dynamics of neurotransmitters. So the aspects of morphology that I focus on, I think I've listed them there. The relative size of different parts of the brain, different areas of the cortex or subcortical structures, and therefore the number of neurons in each region. Characteristics of axons connecting different parts together. And especially I focus there on what is, in principle, starts off as morphology, the caliber of the axon and whether it's myelinated or not, but that determines the conduction velocity in those axons and therefore the conduction time between the cell body and the synapses. And I've built a lot of my theoretical reasoning around that variable. And thirdly, the relative number of several different types of short axon neurons, which are sometimes called interneurons. Now, interneurons are usually inhibitory, and therefore they're likely to play crucial roles in determining the balance between excitation and inhibition in that region of the brain. And I think they may be particularly important in what we call mood disorders, depression and mania, although Carl Wernicke doesn't regard those as primarily mood disorders. And the last of my principles Emphasis on unusual experiences, which you might call symptoms, not diagnoses. Now, I believe this follows Wernicke's own emphases. He was scornful of many of the diagnostic entities that were flying around in his day, though sometimes he insisted you have to get the diagnosis right. Deeper than this, close reading of his Outline of Psychiatry leads me to the view that he saw those unusual experiences reported by his patients as the primary realities, and which he could incorporate into his system only insofar as he could envisage how they arose from processes in the brain as he understood them. Diagnoses, if they were to be used, were of secondary importance compared with those reports of first-hand experiences. I suspect that here he was guided by another seminal figure in the whole of the natural sciences in Germany in the 19th century, Ernst Mach. Ernst Mach was one of a number of people who were whose work spanned the physical sciences and sensory physiology and psychology. But Ernst Mach's aphorism says it all. The world consists of sensation for the scientist as for the common man. Wernicke, I suspect, was adapting that aphorism to his understanding of mental disorders. In the foreword to the 1894 edition of Grundrisse der Psychiatry, Wernicke pays a handsome tribute to an unnamed advocate of theoretical natural science. We came to the conclusion this was probably Ernst Mach, with no evidence that they ever actually met. So let's go, I'm getting towards the end of what I want to say, let's go on to the actual framework. There's Ernst Mach, the actual framework for classification. First of all, I want to begin by excluding conditions which can be attributed exclusively to external causes and ones with a definite neuropathology. And in Wernicke's day, that might mean delirium tremens, that's withdrawal from alcohol syndrome, or GPI in English. This is general paralysis of the insane. I think there's probably another word in German. But anyway, we now know it as tertiary syphilis, neurosyphilis. And then there's the Wernicke-Korsakoff encephalopathy, which we now know is due to thiamine deficiency. Today's equivalents might be disorders due to adverse effects of street drugs, psychiatric sequelae of HIV, AIDS, etc. But what remains is what needs to be classified in this system, and as a whole, these can be called intrinsic disorders of personal wholeness. And these are based on what the human brain is, its normal variation between individuals, and how it reacts to all the social and psychological assaults which we are prey to. And these then are the core mental disorders with which the system deals. And there are then three main divisions. First of all, epochs in people's lives when a person's context for living has been undermined and needs to be rebuilt. And it takes quite a long time to rebuild it. During the process, people are functioning below normal, they may be emotionally labile, and a whole lot of things to do with the smooth way we can normally interact with their environment. They will be impaired. In the end, at the worst, they can't even walk steadily. Secondly, there will be extremes of personality, and then, of course, it's an arbitrary decision whether you say something is a disorder or just an extreme on a normal curve. And the third area in which I want to fit a whole lot of other disorders is either complications of either the first or the second, or combinations of the two. Well, it's a vast amount of work before I can fill in the detail. I'm not bothered with the detail at present. I just want to make a few more comments, and then we can perhaps get on to some questions. But the dividing line between mental disorder and normality is arbitrary in this scheme. Personality variants could be dealt with either as normal variation or as disorders. It is assumed that there is huge variation between the individuals in their brains. This is part of normal human diversity. And also the psychological and social insults to which humanity is always exposed are also endlessly varied. It is the combination of characteristics of the individual's brain, each with their unique strengths and weaknesses, and the particular insults and abuses to which we are all subject, which produces what we refer to as mental disorders. Nowhere in this can one find definite pathology using the term as used in general medicine. But we are all vulnerable to mental disorders in the way I defined it, given our individual characteristics and the slings and arrows which life throws at us. From this, it follows either that we are all subject to mental disorder insofar as the order in our minds is not and cannot be perfect, or there is no such category as mental disorder. In either case, concepts of mental disorder no longer fit within the medical paradigms of illness or disease. They need to be fitted into a larger frame which will include medical disorders. Now, the remaining slides I've got, I'll just show them briefly. I think we've probably got time for a bit of questions. But they're summarising a bit more detail about each of those three categories. So epochs, when a person's context for living has been undermined and needs to be rebuilt. Periods of life transition, that's an idea I get partly from Carl Ludwig Karlbaum in the 1860s. Secondly, life hazards which undermine contexts for living, life-threatening illnesses, bereavements, accidents, etc. And also sometimes, because of the way we live our lives, we are forced to develop contexts which are flatly contradictory to each other. And sometimes when they get pushed hard against each other, we start to show signs of not functioning in a very consistent way. And then the term resilience is what comes when we have been banged on the head so many times that we've developed a context for living which we could cope with almost anything. The point at the bottom, though, is quite important, that I suspect that the tempo for reconstruction of contexts is roughly the same in all cases, about 2 or 3 years, which is the time it takes to become a person from the time of birth to the time when we first acquire the concept of ourselves as a person. Now, the next one, extremes of personality. Now, I've classified these according to the possible causes. Now, vast amounts of detail to be filled in there. This is going to, if I finish this work, it's going to take at least 10 years. And complications, this is just a list of them. But let me just pick out psychosis and refer to schizophrenia. Psychosis I see as an instability of the brain and the mind, which occurs in people who have a constellation of certain personality traits, but probably at certain transitional periods of life, like late adolescence, when they're vulnerable, possibly also triggered by unfortunate life events. Now, the term schizophrenia today, usually we think of it as something that occurs in late adolescence, early adulthood. In principle, the same thing I think could happen at any age. So my last slide is what became of schizophrenia. Notice how you use the word became in the past tense. But the idea is that the same process combining personality traits and times of vulnerability may happen at any stage of life. And the traits themselves are not unique to schizophrenia. They occur in a variety of other diagnoses. So basically, the concept of schizophrenia goes back to the raw data and carves it up in different ways, so that actually we no longer need that term. It comes up in different ways, different sorts of psychosis, different sorts of age, and the non-psychotic traits in a variety of other disorders. I think I'll stop there. There may be time for a few questions, which I'd be very happy to take. Thank you very much.